And here we go. So yeah, that's the introduction. Thank you all so much for coming out. And now that's enough for me. I'd like to introduce Taye. She's a very, very talented, very exceptional therapist who will be leading us in this workshop today.
Thank you, David. I had to figure out how to unmute myself there. I want to thank you all for taking the time to join me today. It's a pleasure for me to be here and explore and discuss a topic that impacts all of us on a day-to-day basis. So for the next hour or so, we're going to spend some time understanding how we experience the world, what we've been through, and where we live impacts who we become and how we interact with the world around us. My goal is to help us gain just a different perspective and understanding how violence impacts the communities that we live in. So I'll just introduce myself briefly. My name is Taye Adeniyi. David, you did an excellent job pronouncing my name, so I appreciate that. My passion is to understand humans and systems, particularly how systems impact human behavior. So today we'll be exploring the relationship between trauma and community violence and how this impacts you and me, particularly how trauma perpetuates community violence. I want to invite each of you to participate in the following activity. So I'd like you to just, everyone get in a comfortable position, sit back and relax. And if you want to close your eyes, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But I would just like you to think about how you got here, where you are today. And I don't mean that in a philosophical or biological sense, but more so in the sense of what decisions led you to live where you live today, work where you work today, associate with those whom you associate with. Whether you made the decision to date, stay single, marry, decision not to marry, your decisions around work, around whether you choose to rent or buy your home, whether you, the decisions you make around budgeting, whether you spend your money or save. I want to encourage you to consider the individuals who influence these decisions, whether it was a parent, a teacher, a professor, a friend, a colleague, an intimate partner. Next, I would encourage you to consider the external factors beyond your control that led to these decisions, such as weather, war, institutions, your social location, your race, ethnicity, gender, sex, your genetic makeup, where you were born, whether you immigrated from a different country or not. I also want you to consider your beliefs that led to these decisions, whether it's your political orientations, your faith, your religious views, your views about the state of the world and the condition of our planet. And I just want you to take a few minutes, few seconds, just thinking about where you are today in the spot that you're in, the decisions you've made, who's influenced those decisions. And the purpose of this exercise is to consider the complexities of our decision-making. It is never a single pathway. I would like us to consider the same when we think of individuals who choose different paths. Who in their life influenced their decisions? What were the external factors that led to their decisions? Could it be poverty, lack of access to resources, their belief systems? What happened to each individual that leads to them making the decisions that they make? And I'd like you to hold space to think about this as we move forward in our time together today. I want to acknowledge that this topic is a pretty heavy one. We're going to be talking about issues. We'll be exploring definitions and terms that, isn't very light for a Sunday afternoon. And I want to ensure that we hold the space for this conversation. And in holding the space, I want to ensure that each one of you takes what you need as we go on. I would like you to pay attention to your body, what you're feeling as we talk, whether you notice any feelings of anger, frustration, irritation, sadness, grief, or loss. If needed, I'd like you to take a break, step away, mute me, get a glass of water, go for a quick walk. send someone a message just to let them know you're okay. And I'd also like you to just engage in a couple grounding exercises as if you find yourself getting a bit overwhelmed. This may include some breathing, taking 10 deep breaths, holding it in, and then releasing it slowly. Another great grounding exercise is just reminding yourself of who you are now and where you are. Say your name to yourself, your age, where you are, what you've done today, what you're going to do next. For example, my name is Taye Adeniyi. I am 34 years old. I am in my office, in my home. And I woke up fairly early today, excited to be here, definitely nervous. And I went for coffee with some friends, had a great meal. So that's grounding me. And even as I talk about this, the anxiety that inevitably comes as we engage in these presentations, I can feel it leaving. And I feel a sense of comfort. I feel a sense of I'm grounded in this moment right now. And I'm feeling even more just connected. There's a sense of, yeah, this is who I am. This is where I am. And in doing that, I'm observing this release of the emotional reactions of the anxiety that comes. All right, so let's talk about our objectives together. I acknowledge that there's going to be a lot of information communicated today. I also acknowledge that these presentations can be, it can be concentrated in terms of so much information in a little amount of time. So I'd like you to listen. There's going to be, kind of a story that we're going to weave as we spend our time together today. It's going to be a story about who we are as individuals, about the people that we interact with, and the communities in which we live in. So listen with your heart, listen with your head, but most importantly, my hope is that just a different way of thinking, a different perspective is gained today. So just a quick overview on what we're going to talk about. We'll take some time to define community, specifically looking at community violence. We'll also take some time to define trauma, specifically looking at community trauma. Also, I'd like us to talk today about ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, as well as adverse community experiences and toxic stress. And then we'll look at the wheel wellness and the 8 components that contribute to individual wellness. My hope today is that a seed is planted. I'd like for us to take some time to just create a seed for it to grow. I don't imagine being the one to grow the seed. I might play a role, but the seed will be grown in different aspects. So I spent some time reflecting, what am I hoping individuals will get out of this today? And my hope is that something is planted, whether it just impacts your ability to, the way you think about other individuals, even asking the question of, instead of what's wrong with you, what happened to you. My hope is that we look at ourselves as individuals and the individuals in our lives differently through our time together today. So I don't think we can talk about community without talking about connection. And when we think of ourselves, we oftentimes think we're relatively immune to the impact of other individuals or our society. We like to think of ourselves as individuals who are in control of our destiny, who make our own decisions. And in his book, Social, Matthew Lieberman discusses how across many studies of mammals, from the smallest rodents all the way to us humans, the data suggests that we are profoundly shaped by our social environment, and that we suffer greatly when our social bonds are threatened or severed. We may not like the fact that we are wired such that our well-being depends on our connections with others, but facts are facts. And, I was asking myself, am I going to bring in COVID in the context of all this? And I didn't intend to, but as I'm talking about that, I can't think of how COVID and the lockdowns has impacted us in the last 2.5 years, leaving us more isolated. There's been just an awareness, more of a willingness to talk about mental health, and more of the awareness of how lack of social connectedness, lack of being together, especially being together in a physical sense, impacts our mental health. So I'd like us to keep in mind the importance of connection when we think about community. So I invite you guys to participate if you'd like to, whether you want to unmute yourselves or just type something in the chat box. When we think about community, what comes to mind for you? I'm actually realizing I don't even know where my chat box is. David, if you don't mind, if anything does come up, do you mind reading it out loud? Oh, I see it. Okay, I'm seeing a network of people, togetherness, caring, sharing, friends. Perfect. Common experience. Yes. Great. Thank you. Yes, so that goes back to my next slide. A network of people. It's about people, togetherness, caring, sharing. And so I can imagine that when I title this community violence, if we think about what we originally, what comes to mind when we think about community, violence doesn't often come to mind, right? So community isn't a place. No one mentioned our geographical location or a physical place. It was more about the people and the common experience, right? So it's an exchange of information. It can be an exchange of information. It can be when people gather together, a feeling, a set of relationships among people. People form communities to meet their common needs. Now, I want us to kind of consider perhaps varying definitions of communities, interest communities and geographic communities. Interest communities do not usually have a spatial base, but are connected through common interests, such as sporting community or an academic community. A geographic community is one defined over geographic space, right? So some type of social interaction or common tie is usually included in this type of definition, as well as communities have something in common that is not shared with people outside the community. So as I mentioned, I want us to focus on communities that consist of a common location, common ties, social interactions, and interdependencies. But keeping in mind that this isn't a sufficient definition of community. So how we connect to our community matters. The more difficult it is to connect in geographical communities, the more we feel disconnected. And, you know, I have a thought that I wanted to explore on this, but I was like, am I ready? Will I be too nervous? But I'll try it. So just bear with me. I've been thinking a lot about how like individuals come together, especially in our modern society, and how we form geographical communities. You know, historically, you know, individuals didn't leave where they were born. We live in a society where it's so easy to move from one country to the next, one city to the next. Even if we look at the current housing situation, many people are making decisions to move, not necessarily because it's their ideal or where their friends are or where their communities are, but because it's where it's affordable, right? So when we consider that, we have to consider how that might impact the ability for communities to exist within geographical locations. If people may feel like I'm not necessarily making this choice to be here, or I'm living in a community where people are not necessarily, where I don't identify or connect with the individuals, that will make a significant impact in terms of whether or not we see a healthy community. And in a healthy communities, members have a sense of trust, belonging, safety, and caring for each other. They have an individual and collective sense of who they are, that they are part of a community, and that they can influence their environments and each other. That treasured feeling of community comes from shared experiences and a sense of not necessarily the actual existence of shared history. So again, going back to that notion of how we're finding our geographical locations now, it isn't necessarily about a sense of, I have this shared history. It's about, where is it affordable for me to live? So that will automatically have an impact on what we see when people come together and whether or not we see connectedness. So I'll now move on to the topic of community violence. And, you know, I've been kind of looking at the stats lately, and I haven't dug deep into the research, but I do believe that there's an awareness that in the last year or so, there's been an increase in crime, right? And again, I'm ever so curious and I'm always asking questions. So I'm like, what's going on here? Is it the fact that we've been isolated so much that we no longer know how to interact and be social with one another? Does it have to do with the fact that, you know, there's been a migration of individuals moving to different areas? And as I mentioned, it's harder to connect when you're not necessarily going together because you have common interests, but because it's where it's affordable. So I do think that, you know, while this is, you know, perhaps a heavy topic to consider, I feel like it's a very important topic that we start talking about. Also, as we're seeing more of a polarization in our society as well, where individuals are more willing to be vocal about what their views are and reactive if the other individuals' views are not similar to them. So, as I talk today, I am going to talk a little bit more about perhaps physical forms of violence, just wanting to keep that in mind, but of course there's other forms of violence as well. So community violence is defined as an intentional act of interpersonal violence, often committed in public areas by individuals who are not intimately related to the victim. In 2018, the Toronto Board of Health recognized exposure to community violence, which they distinguished from domestic violence, as a social determinant of health. Growing up in the midst of community violence can impact children and youth's social, emotional, behavioral, and cognitive development. It can disrupt their baseline of safety, making it more difficult for entire families and communities to sustain a sense of stability. For those who live in or near places where violence is very common, the daily risk can take a toll on physical and emotional health. And the lingering psychological impacts left on children with ongoing exposure to violence and trauma are immeasurable. Violence holds victims, families, friends, and entire neighborhoods hostage, causing paralyzing fear and trauma that is ongoing. Community violence is everyone's business because not a single person in a community is left unaffected by the damaging effects that violence leaves behind. And the slide that you're seeing now kind of talks about the factors that contribute to community violence, ranging from individual factors. And this can be early exposure to violence, lack of support for academic pursuits, and also impulse control difficulties. The relational factors, which could be conflict in the home, poor monitoring, exposure to delinquent peers, no access, lack of access to supportive adults, and societal, which is exposure to messages that accept violence, and lack of policies that provide access to resources in certain communities, such as job opportunities and prevention programming. Also, the community itself, so the geographic community, factors such as unstable housing, neighborhood crime, gang activity, isolation, and lack of connectedness in the community. So the personal impact of community violence. Research shows that the following are impacts of exposure to community violence. This includes increased rates of preterm birth and low birth weight, mental health impacts such as fear, depression, anxiety, PTSD, increased incidence of alcohol abuse, sense of helplessness and lack of self-efficacy, anger, aggression, low survival expectations. Young people in violent neighborhoods often don't expect to live into adulthood. Physical health impacts. Children often have no safe place to play, and adults exercise less because of fear of going out. The social impacts include those who are fearful in their communities. They see their friends less often and participate in fewer social activities. Parenting impacts include parents who are unable to cope with exposure to community violence, have difficulty bonding with their children, and are more likely to form an anxious, disorganized, disoriented attachment with their child rather than a secure one. Research also shows lower achievement in schools and stigma. There is judgment by the media and broader community that when someone is shot, the immediate reaction is, what did they do to deserve this? Media and police response can trigger a lack of interest or concern by the public if the victim is labeled as being known to the police. And people who live in violent neighborhoods often feel like they can't use their address when searching for work because of the stigma. Some more impacts. Fear in the communities now then go on the rise. In some areas, people feel scared to go out. The playgrounds are controlled by drug dealers and gang members. Innocent people are at risk because some shooters pursue their targets with no concern for innocent bystanders. People grow afraid of each other and are unwilling to help each other. Shootings aren't always reported. Therefore, the resources to address gun violence are often not allocated to the community. And parents can be afraid to let their children participate in the community. When communities live with fear, they often internalize it and see others as outsiders, which leads to further isolation. A code of silence takes hold. There is a fear of retaliation if someone calls the police to report a crime or to give a witness statement. Ineffective witness protection programs serve to reinforce the snitch code. This fuels a code of silence. The level of fear in some neighborhoods is indescribable, especially among some mothers. There's significant intimidation to ensure that people don't talk to the police. And I just want to talk really quickly about the snitch code. What interests me is how relevant that is, even for youth. Youth feel this sense of like, I cannot tell because I'll be seen as a snitch. And for them to face the consequence of crime is more important, is they would rather do that than to be seen as a snitch. So this notion of taking a code of silence, that's done for their own perceived feeling of safety. But as we can see, it also perpetuates the crime. In these neighborhoods, the communities and the youth get stereotyped. The media portrays a negative stereotype of the community, and the people from the community, they start internalizing and believing the stereotype. Youth have a hard time getting jobs because of where they live. And the communities, including the youth, they get desensitized to the violence. Young children are exposed to violence and learn from it, whether it's at home or seeing a violent police takedown. Children as young as 9 years old, they talk about it as if the violence is normal. Violence also becomes an acceptable way of dealing with conflict. When violence goes unaddressed, it perpetuates violence. Youth resort to violence to resolve disputes. They feel they need to be violent in order to survive and preserve their honor. Gangs are then created. Gangs are often linked to criminal activities, but youth also hang out in groups as a way of looking out for each other. The problem is that it can be hard for people to tell the difference, and groups of youth, regardless of their intent, can intimidate people. And again, when we think about groups of Black youth, racialized youth, when they're together, oftentimes people have this perceived sense of threat or fear. This notion that, are they gangs? Do they have criminal intent? Even if they could just be together playing casually, going for a walk together. In these neighborhoods, we also see increased police presence. Many youth talked about not receiving respect from police and about experiencing problems with police harassment. They talked about youth getting pulled over for no reason. They don't feel like they can move freely in their own neighborhoods. Focusing on school is also harder for students, and teaching is harder. Living in an environment without security drains people's mental energy. Trying to meet the needs of students with a high teacher-to-student ratio is already a difficult task. And with the added challenges created by poverty, a lot of students fall through the cracks. Schools are then not seen as safe places. Youth get bullied at school, and bullying becomes more violent. Growing numbers of youth are expelled from school. They carry weapons to protect themselves and drop out more frequently or transfer because schools are safe. I just want to speak briefly about that as well. I work with youth, and when I hear about violence that occurs in schools, youth bringing weapons into schools, I share this, and when you see the lived reality of this happening, it really sinks in that this is the everyday lived experience of many youth, given the communities they live in, and whether or not they feel safe or not. As a result, more youth suffer from depression, which can lead them to have thoughts of suicide and self-harm, as well as substance abuse. Violence also hurts youth self-esteem and stops youth from having ambition to do anything. And in addition, social service agencies struggle to keep up with the demand for services. There's not enough funding, and agencies are competing instead of working together. Once youth get involved in violent lifestyle, it's very difficult for them to get out. Now, I want to start to kind of make that connection between trauma and community violence. Before going in, I kind of want to acknowledge this topic of trauma, because, I would say, like, in the last 5 to 10 years, we've heard this word in a way that I don't believe society has talked about it before. People are more willing to share their stories. They're more willing to talk about what's happened to them. And a lot more people are willing to access the services that they need to address what they've been through. That being said, there's a lot of researchers and experts that are worried that our usage of the word trauma is becoming so widespread that it's losing its meaning. There is a worry that, everything is now being perceived, any adversity or painful or distressing situation is now being perceived as trauma. And there are mental health professionals, researchers, experts that worry that if we then engage in an overuse of the word, it will lose its meaning and our understanding of other what we've traditionally known to be traumatic events, such as war, natural disasters. I've often thought about this, and I land in a place where I'm like, well, what other term could we use? If not trauma, what else would we use to describe the things that have happened to us that have a lasting impact in who we become, how we interact with the world, how we see ourselves, how we see others? These emotional responses, or the way our body reacts to certain situations, the triggers that we experience. If not trauma, what other term would we use? And I think we're lacking a language that is nuanced enough to capture the experience that we experience collectively and individually. We need other terms to describe our human experience. And I think because we don't have these terms, our inclination then becomes to generalize trauma, to allow it to speak into what our experience has been. And, I will still use this term. I will still use it as we talk today, because I do think that it builds for self-awareness and awareness of how we work and how other humans work too. And I also think it allows us to just pursue a greater understanding of how is what has happened to me impacted who I've become and how I engage with the world around me. And I think it's important that we ask ourselves these questions. If we're going to even get into a path of considering change, considering transformation, we need to ask ourselves, what has happened to me that's led me to be where I am today? What has happened to my community? What has happened to others whom I engage in that's led us to be where we are today? So the word trauma is derived from the Greek word for womb, It is still used today to describe physical injury in medical settings, and the idea of trauma as psyche damage didn't emerge until the late 1880s. Trauma can be defined as an emotional response from an event, a series of events or circumstances that are interpreted as harmful or life-threatening and have the potential to result in lasting negative effects on one's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Traumatic experiences can impact an individual's health and well-being. Individuals who experience such events do not perceive or react to them in the same way. Trauma may not always be the result. Individuals may experience potentially traumatic events without suffering trauma. And I think that statement is very important because that allows us to realize that trauma is more about the situation, but also how we experience the situation. And how we experience it is very subjective. It's based on many different factors, which we'll talk about. But I think that this also should lead us to kind of pause and step back and consider more that perhaps it's not about defining an event as whether or not it justifies being traumatic or not, but perhaps it's more about how does the event impact the individual's functioning? How is it impacted, or how does it affect their physical and their mental health? Is there a lasting impact? How is it impacting how they interact with the world, how they perceive themselves? So witnessing or experiencing an event that poses a real or perceived threat can be considered a traumatizing experience, especially if the event overwhelms the person's ability to cope. There are, from the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, there's PTSD and acute trauma, right? So these are official diagnoses of trauma, but then there's also traumatic stress, which refers to the physical and emotional responses that a person experiences to threatening situation. Traumatic events can overwhelm a person's capacity to cope and elicit feelings of terror, powerlessness, and out of control physiological arousal. Post-traumatic stress reactions, which we'll talk about a little bit later, includes re-experiencing the event, avoidance, hyperarousal, and persistent difficult thoughts and emotions. So I'll just go through some definitions of trauma. And again, I'm touching base on 6, but it's possible that there's more as well. So acute trauma refers to a one-time event, such as an earthquake, a fire, assault, or car accident. Chronic trauma refers to traumatic experiences that are repeated and prolonged, such as ongoing exposure to family or community violence, chronic bullying, or a long-term medical issue. Complex trauma refers to exposure to multiple traumatic events from an early age, often within the caregiving system or without adequate adult support, which has short and long-term effects in many areas. Examples include abuse and neglect within families, witnessing domestic violence, or experiencing other forms of violence or adversity without adequate adult support. Historical trauma refers to collective and cumulative trauma experienced by a group across generations that are still suffering the effects. This includes discrimination, violence, and oppression of particular groups. Racial or race-based trauma refers to experiences of racially driven discrimination, harassment, and systemic oppression. Intergenerational trauma refers to trauma that's been passed down through the family line. This is a slide that just shows a series of potentially traumatic events, previous life experiences, peer supports, personal coping skills, family histories, and community reactions are some factors that can actually influence each individual's response to traumatic events. So again, many people may experience traumatic events, but the impact of the traumatic events or the effects may differ based on many different factors. I don't know if I should pause if anybody has questions. I know we've been going for some time now. So perhaps I'll just create space if anyone has any questions or comments at this time. Okay. Okay, I will keep going. So a person's response to a traumatic event may have a profound effect on his or her perception of themselves, others, the world, and the future. Traumatic events may affect a person's ability to trust others, their sense of personal safety, their effectiveness in navigating life changes. The impact of potentially traumatic events is also determined by both objective nature of the event and the person's subjective response to it. Something that is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another. I'm curious how people feel about that statement. I don't know if anyone wants to share, but even as we talk about trauma, what trauma is, as we look at this varying definition, that it is perhaps considering it to be more of a subjective response and how the individual is impacted. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on that. Yes, I see Prophetess. If you want to share, please.
Sure. I remember back when I was, in my 20s, a girlfriend of mine was murdered. And even though it was so many years ago, you still think about them. So it's the ongoing trauma, how she died. It was just so violent. And so it's one of those things that never leave you. You carry it for years after years. And so I don't know what kind of, I wouldn't know, I don't know how exactly to frame that, but it's so ongoing that it's like a part of your life, of this loss that we were friends and now she's not there, kind of thing. And as you talk about violence, it's just, I think it's just so hard to understand why, and then how do you manage that, and it's very traumatic because as I said, it's just ongoing. It never leaves you. Think about it all the time, but you just learn how to cope, I guess.
Thank you for sharing. And I appreciate you sharing your story with us, right? Talking about how losing a loved one that you cared about, and you said even years later, you still remember, the pain is still there, it doesn't go away. And that's the hard thing about when we experience traumatic events, right? It doesn't leave us. As you mentioned, we learn to cope, but making sense of it becomes very difficult, becomes very hard. Why did this happen? How did this happen? Why her? And these questions become nearly impossible to answer. And then it becomes, how do I cope? How do I adjust? And I'll mention briefly about post-traumatic growth as well, because there is, a system of thought that believes that we can also grow from what has happened to us, and it can change who we are, how we live our lives, the things that matter to us, the things that we prioritize. But when we experience tragedy, just such as the one you experienced, Prophetess, it does really affect our view of life and our view of, who we are and how we ascribe meaning to how we live. Thank you for sharing. Yes, I see your hand as well. Please go.
Hi, so in response to your comment about something that is traumatic for one person that may not be traumatic for another, I think it's important to remember that each person is individually different. So two people experiencing the same trauma may still come away with different experiences, and their coping could still be different as well. So I really do think it is a really subjective experience, I think.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So I'd like us to look at some risk factors that that impact how we respond to traumatic events. Some of these risk factors include the lack of stable, nurturing relationships, our age at the time of the event, our gender. For individuals who experience interpartner violence and sexual violence, females are more likely to be at risk of experiencing lasting traumatic impact. For males, it's violence in the community. The individual's status, so their race, their ethnicity, their religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, that plays a role in terms of how they experience these events. One's mental health, psychiatric illness, whether or not one uses substances, disability, physical and mental, family history of violence, homelessness, poverty, and one's adverse childhood experiences. Some of the conditions that are related to trauma are psychiatric illnesses, and that includes both physical and also chronic illnesses as well. Sexually transmitted infections, sleep disorders, poor educational attainment. You guys can see the list there. I'm sure I don't have to read through it as well. The protective factors that do kind of impact one's experience of trauma and whether or not it has a lasting effect are supportive family relationships, well-resourced safe communities, financial security, employment, stable housing, higher educational status, higher brain executive functioning, community engagement, and good health. So I'm not going to go into we're not going to explore all of this, but I wanted to share this so that we could see that trauma impacts the whole body, from our physiological response, so how we experience our emotions. And when I think of emotions, I think of it as literally energy and motion in our bodies. So there's an emotional reaction when we experience traumatic events, but also if we're triggered further from these traumatic events. There's also a physical reaction. There's a cognitive, it impacts the way we think, it impacts the way we interact with the world. And this is the area that I really enjoy talking about, but I'm also mindful of the time. But I still wanted to include this because I do think it's important that we realize that. And this is why trauma is also very much subjective. Who am I to say what your body experiences? How do I tell you how you experience your emotions or your thoughts? And so this is where, again, it's really about the individual's experience and the impact on their cognition, their their physical makeup, their emotions, and also their behavior. My slide is not moving. Their behavior and their relationships as well, right? So all these domains are affected by trauma. And this is why, when we consider how does trauma impact the individual, how does adverse or, painful events impact the individual, it is really a subjective experience because our bodies react differently, right? I wanted to spend some time to talk about ACEs, just briefly. Has anyone heard about adverse childhood experiences? I'm very curious if anyone has had like a medical professional talk to them about ACEs before. No, I see Claire, you shaking your head there. So it's, this is a relatively, when I think about the history of knowledge and okay, I see someone in the chat box here. David said he hasn't heard the term, but has experienced it. Thank you, David. And thank you for differentiating between that as well. That's great. ACEs became, it became a topic to be discussed and talked about in 1998. A research study was conducted. And in that research study, they started to understand and see how the experiences that children have impact their health outcomes in adulthood. Okay. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and the experiences can include things like physical, emotional abuse, physical and emotional abuse, neglect, caregiver mental illness, and household violence. And when we look at ACEs, it's what's seen in your first 18 years of life. There's, I actually thought about putting up the actual questionnaire. It's about 10 questions, and it's believed that at least 65% of the population have at least one adverse childhood ACE. Sorry, I should term that have at least an ACE score of 1. Right, and the interesting thing about our ACEs or ACE scores is that it's not necessarily dependent on our, our race or our socioeconomic status. These are events that impact all of us, regardless of our social location. The reality is, the more ACEs a child experiences, the more likely he or she is to suffer from things like heart disease, diabetes, poor academic achievement, and substance use later in life. Experiences ACEs, as well as things like racism and community violence without supportive adults, can cause what's known as toxic stress. The excessive activation of the stress response system can lead to long-lasting wear and tear on the body and the brain. And again, this is another topic that I feel very strongly about, and this is where, again, I often wonder, like, how can we determine what is a traumatic event and what is not? What is stressful and what is not? When it's how the body responds and how the body reacts. And if someone is under such toxic stress, to the point where their body is in constant fight, flight, or freeze, how do I then go to them and say what you're experiencing is not real or is not valid? So when we think about trauma, and when we think about stress and toxic stress in particular, it's really about how it impacts our body, how it impacts our brains. And I want to I thought communicating this in a video would be very perhaps helpful. So we'll spend about 2 minutes just watching this video on toxic stress.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
I just want to take a few minutes to sit with that. I don't know if, as you heard the heart beating, I'm not sure if you felt it. I felt it. I felt just this quickening in my body. And, even as he talks about how we address toxic stress, I felt this sense of like, we need to talk about this. We need to do something about this. but also the sense of how do we talk about this? How do we address this? So I want to just open the floor to give people some time to share their thoughts, what they think about, trauma, toxic stress, how it impacts the body. Yeah, I just wanted to give space. Even if someone wants to put in the chat, does it make sense? Can they relate? Have they, and again, no, you don't have to go into detail in terms of your experience, but can you relate? David, I see your hand up. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for introducing this. It's really interesting to hear this because I feel like so much of my adulthood has just been learning about the things that I felt but didn't quite know. And now it's really interesting to hear about more in depth I guess the clinical side of it, and like how we know that this can actually manifest and the consequences it has, because it's insightful, I guess, for me at least.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. I see someone in the chat as well. Claire is asking, can toxic stress develop exclusively in childhood or also after during adulthood? Great question. And yes, in adulthood as well, especially when we consider, our current situation, like in terms of how fast our life are, the expectations that we have of ourselves in terms of work, and again, I don't want to say that these situations are normally stressful, right? So toxic stress then becomes, how does my body react and respond to these stressful situations? Is my body constantly in this fight or flight or freeze mode? Am I constantly feeling tense? Am I constantly feeling anxious? Am I constantly feeling like I'm on alert? Am I constantly feeling like I'm on go, go, go? Do I have a hard time relaxing? Do I have a hard time feeling connected, feeling socially engaged? Do I have a hard time remaining calm? What is my heart rate? All those things are signs of toxic stress. And this for me was specifically in relation to how it develops in childhood. But part of the health outcomes that happen in later adulthood is a result of the continued toxic stress, right? So when, and this is where I hope that this becomes more of a prevalent topic in our medical system, because it's important that we then start to consider, how does stress impact my body and the illnesses that I then, have? How does it impact heart disease? How does it impact other types of disease? How does it impact mental health, right? So to your question, yes, it is also something we experience in adulthood. Thank you. So we'll move on to talking about community trauma as well. Should we take a break? Let's take a 5-minute break. Perhaps everyone take some time to just ground themselves, get a quick glass of water, perhaps go look at the sun outside for a bit. Yeah, let's take a 5-minute break and then we'll come back. Thanks. I hope I gave everyone enough time. I didn't want to go too long because I'm mindful of the time. If people can just kind of chat, put in their chat boxes that they're here, and I'll get started again. In the meantime, I will answer. I saw Claire's question. She was asking about ways to address toxic stress. And Claire, again, thank you. Great question. I will talk a little bit more about that. But again, I do appreciate that transitioning from trauma, toxic stress to community trauma, there feels like perhaps there's a bit of a gap there. So we will spend a little bit of time talking about ways to address it. And so I think one of the most important things is developing an increased awareness of one's body and how one's body interacts with the world around them. And I was thinking about doing like some practical grounding exercises, but I'm also very mindful that for many people it's hard to engage in their body, and it's hard to familiarize themselves with how their body communicates to them. And when I think of trauma, I think of the body, and I think about how the body interacts with the world. And so when I think about addressing toxic stress and trauma, I think of addressing it from the body. And so something to be mindful about is how it's not in a state of relaxation. Is there cues that my body gives me? Do I feel tension in my neck? Do I get tension headaches? Does my jaw clench? Do I start to feel sick in my stomach? Do I get really warm and really hot? Do I get fidgety? Do I feel restless? So our body is always communicating to us. The question is, do we listen? Are we listening? So I think the first step is increasing your awareness of your body. And that can be done in activities. I know even just walking. So I'll combine that with mindfulness, right? Because mindfulness is increasing awareness of one's environment and where one is in. Okay? So, so when we think about mindfully being aware of our bodies, that can be done through something as simple as like mindful eating, being aware of the process of eating. How am I eating? What am I eating? How does my body respond to what I'm eating? Am I eating out of hunger? Am I eating out of to satiate myself? Am I eating because there's an emotional reaction to that? When we go for walks, that's an opportunity to also be mindful about our bodies. When we engage in conflict, that's a great opportunity to be aware of our bodies. What am I feeling as I'm reacting this way? Am I feeling hot? Am I feeling tense? So, in addressing toxic stress, it's really about the body, and it's really about how the body, because we can't eliminate stress from our lives, right? But what we can do is we can address how does the stress I experience impact my body and my body's inclination to react to these stressful situations. How does my body react? And that's the piece that we can start to have control over. There's, therapy is a great way to start that process as well. Individuals engage in yoga, they feel like that's a beneficial way as well. Anything that engages the mind and the body, activities like that increase awareness of the body is a great way to address toxic stress. I know probably a long-winded answer, but did you want to add anything else, or does anybody else have any questions as well? Okay. So we'll start to talk about community trauma. And again, as I mentioned, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? Sorry. Okay, that's better. So as I mentioned, when I think about trauma, I think about the body, and I think about how the body is affected by what happens in one's environment, what happens in one's mind. And so as we talk, I want you to be mindful that as we talk through these terms and definitions, start to consider, like, how does what individuals go through impact their bodies? You know, the individual within the context of society, the individual's body within the context of society, the individual's body within the context of what they go through. And should I say it? So even when I think about race, right? Like there's this notion of, you know, is there racism? Is there not racism? When I think about race is about one's body. Gender is about one's body. Ethnicity, in some ways, becomes about one's body as well. And so the way we interact with the world is very much about the bodies in which we carry and how our bodies then is affected by what we go through. So we'll define community trauma, and then we'll move on to just talk a little bit more about how community trauma impacts the individual. And I'm going to combine adverse childhood experiences and community trauma, and then we'll continue to weave this story. So community trauma is the impact of chronic adversity across a community. The trauma manifests at the community level and is not just the aggregate of individuals in a neighborhood who have experienced trauma, but the symptoms are also observable in the social cultural interactions. So in the environment, whether it's the buildings or the parks, in the economic and educational opportunities as well in the community. Community trauma can also be thought of as an event that impacts a few people, but has structural and social traumatic consequences. Now, the literature interchanges between community trauma and collective trauma. My mind likes to think of them differently, but again, I'm not the expert. So I'll tell you that they do talk, they use the terms interchangeably. But I see them as different in a way, and I'll share with you the definition of collective trauma. Collective trauma is a response that can follow a variety of traumatic experiences. Situations that may elicit a collective trauma response may include wars, natural disasters, mass shootings, terrorism, pandemics, systemic and historical oppressions, recessions, and famine or severe poverty. And so I think the reason why I don't see them as interchangeable is when I think about community, we talked about the difference of community, the definition of community. It's a shared interest, shared, like people are coming together for a common goal, shared experience. So, and this is where I think it can be interchangeable because the trauma becomes the shared experience. The trauma becomes the shared event. So I can understand why it's used interchangeably. But when I think about collective trauma, I think of something that we can see at like a global scale, a national scale. But when I think of community trauma, I think of it as something that perhaps could impact, you know, the Oakwood Bond community, but perhaps not, you know, the Mississauga community, right? So I think that's why I have a difficult time interchanging them. But I will say that in literature, it's often interchangeable. So whether we're using the term community trauma or collective trauma, these traumatic experiences can lead to an onset of physiological, psychological, relational, societal, and spiritual consequences. And reality becomes kind of questioned and turned upside down. Although the trauma is dealt with collectively, the experiences and individual responses can vary greatly, which may lead to increased confusion about what collective trauma looks like. And so I think about even what we've all gone through collectively in terms of the pandemic and COVID. You know, some people may say, well, it was great for me. I had a chance to start new projects. I left my career, started new careers. Others might say, it was one of the hardest things I've ever gone through. And again, and then the question becomes, was the pandemic, was COVID a collective traumatic experience? Can we say it? Would we all agree? Would some people say yes, others say no? And again, this is the convoluted, nuanced topic of trauma, right? The subjective experience. We saw higher interpersonal violence during the pandemic. We saw higher suicide rates. So again, these effects are very much there. This notion of should we call it trauma or not, there's a question around that. And I won't say which one, but I'll just allow you to consider that it's a nuanced, complicated topic. Now, there are other situations where collectively we can say it was a traumatic event, and that would be example after the terrorist attacks in September 11, 2001. There was a lot of changes that happened as a response to that. Security was enhanced, transportation and travel policies came, and that was a response to what we saw as a nation, as a world, as a collective trauma. Again, what was the individual impact of this trauma? That's uncertain. And I think another reason why we can more easily define a situation such as, the attacks 9/11 as traumatic is because it kind of falls under that umbrella of like war and a disaster, right? Does anybody want to share their thoughts on the pandemic? Can it be seen as traumatic? I'm not giving any clear answers. I'm just creating space for conversation and to consider what this is. And if I've confused you, I apologize. Okay, perhaps I'll move on. Okay, I see someone in the chat. So Bill's saying, I think the pandemic was both very traumatic and also triggered traumatic responses. Yes. Yeah. I don't know. I'm really mindful of the time. I'm curious, Bill, if you want to elaborate, or perhaps we'll just leave it there. We can also leave it because I am also mindful of the time, and I'm mindful of where I'm at as well. So I'm just going to
I guess all what I'm saying is that for some people, the impact of the pandemic triggered memories of intergenerational trauma, loss of employment, loss of income, and isolation was much more acute. And a lot of it had to do with your socioeconomic location in our community. So I think and then for some people, I guess there was some trauma. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah. And, I know I said I wasn't going to share like my particular opinion, but I would have to agree that there was a lot that happened that even if the actual pandemic wasn't traumatic for some, things that have happened as, with the lockdown, with the further isolation, we're seeing the effects of it. We're seeing the responses of it. Right? And I think we'll continue to see it for a while longer. So we'll watch a video where he actually started the Prevention Institute, and they really focus on adverse community experiences. And he's going to talk a little bit about community trauma.
I'm Howard Penderhughes. I'm a professor at the University of California, San Francisco in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences, and I work and foundation resilience for families and for children and youth. We've really come to understand the scope of individual trauma, and it's resulted in a sea change in terms of our approaches to addressing individual trauma through trauma-informed care, trauma-informed pedagogy. But one of the things we haven't been able to concentrate on as comprehensively, and we're beginning to start to understand, is the issue of community trauma. When we talk about community trauma, we're not just talking about an aggregate of individuals who have trauma in a community. We're talking about the aspects and dynamics of a community that have been impacted by historical trauma, by structural violence, that those pieces, the social relationships in a community, the social networks in a community, the built environment of a community, and the social norms within a community, as well as the structure of opportunity and education, have all been negatively affected. We have to engage in strategies that help heal communities from community trauma. I'm Howard Pinder.
I included that because, again, I feel like it's important that we consider how do we heal from community trauma? If we understand how community can be a source of pain and can impact how we respond to this pain through trauma, how do we address it at a community level? And again, I'm very mindful of the time, so I will skip through some of my slides, but I do want to look at this slide right here, because again, it talks about how structural violence impacts the violence that we see in the community, and then the trauma that we experience in a community level. And some of these structural violence includes concentrated poverty, gentrification and redlining, disappropriate toxic exposure, which leads to environmental injustice, poor transportation systems, poor food systems. I'm just going to read a couple others: failing school systems, over policing or under policing, criminalization of mental illness and substance abuse, which again then leads to what we see in communities: community violence, gang violence, sexual violence, fear of violence, and then loss from violence, which then leads to the cycle of community violence. And I think this will kind of share moving on. So I see someone in the chat box, so I'll just take a moment to look at that. Someone's asking for a copy of the slides. Yes, and David's told me I can take longer. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. So I find that this slide does a great job at helping us understand the intersection between adverse childhood experiences and adverse community experiences, and how that impacts us as individuals. The adverse childhood experiences encompass emotional and sexual abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, incarceration, homelessness, divorce. These are things that happen to us as individuals. The community issues that impact us are poverty, community disruption, lack of opportunity, lack of economic mobility and social capital, violence, discrimination, poor housing quality, and affordability, right? And as I mentioned, so even the notion of adverse community experiences, that's a very new concept. It's only been in the last 5 years that we're even talking about how does our community impact who we become as individuals and what our experiences are and the trauma that we carry with us. And in Philadelphia, they expanded the ACE questionnaires, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences questionnaires, to also look at it at a community level as well. And so they incorporated questions such as witnessing violence, whether you felt discrimination, whether there'd been adverse neighborhood experiences, whether an individual had been experienced bullying or lived in foster care. I included this slide because I I felt it was really interesting to then see how, again, we have our adverse childhood experiences, which is the leaves on the tree. We have our adverse community experiences, which is the roots of the tree. And then we have the adverse environment experiences, which is the climate crisis, wildfires and smoke, sea levels rising, tornadoes and hurricanes. And all of this then impacts us as individuals and how we interact with the world around us. And so when I think of this, how can we say that we're not impacted by what happens to us, and impacted at a very, again, when we think about trauma in the body, our bodies become impacted by this as well, right? My body becomes impacted by, the environment I'm in, whether or not I face discrimination, what my schools are like, whether or not there's jobs available for me. I'd even invite you to consider the process of what it's like to look for work. How does that impact you? Do you become more tired? Do you experience more symptoms of depression? Is there more feelings of hopelessness, right? So these community experiences have a direct impact on us as individuals, on our bodies. And in some ways, we would consider them when we think about the impact of stress and toxic stress. These could be considered as trauma, again, specifically looking at how does it impact our bodies. So we'll look at some symptoms of community trauma. And when we consider the symptoms, I'd like us to consider them from a physical, social, cultural, and then the economic and educational level. So the physical symptoms of community trauma can include treated or unhealthy spaces and abilities. So when we think about spaces, consider part of these are more litter. Is the equipment up to date? Is it in working condition? Does the environment feel safe? The buildings run down. Is it vibrant? Is there even things as simple as like the way the landscaping is done? Is there flowers? Is there a lack of flowers? Is the environment inviting? Is it not inviting? The physical environment can oftentimes be a symptom of what the community is experiencing. If the community isn't feeling connected, if they're not feeling engaged, they're less likely to invest in their physical environment. The social cultural symptoms include damaged social relationships and networks, elevation of destructive social norms, a low sense of collective political and social efficacy, and a widespread sense of fear and shame. And, I was reading an article and I was talking about support within communities. And one thing that made me curious was, the article was talking about how in Black communities, Black businesses have a hard time of supporting one another. And I became very curious about this. And then when I think about community trauma and racial trauma and how that's impacted, the Black community, I then can't help but wonder, is there a social cultural, is the lack of, networking within, is the lack of referring, connecting one another, connecting to businesses, is that a reflection of social cultural trauma? And again, these questions come to mind. I don't have answers, but I don't think it's always about answers. I think sometimes it's about trying to make sense of the world around us and what we're seeing happening. I'm curious about what could be leading to that happening. What could be leading to the physical environments that we see? Is it just that people don't care? Or is there a lack of connectedness, a lack of engagement? And is this because of other structural issues, structural violence that has occurred long before my body and another person's body began interacting with one another? Do I bring in something? Do I bring in preconceived notion? Does my body remember certain things that I'm not even cognitively aware of that then impacts how I relate to other people, how I relate to my community? I'll move on to economic and educational symptoms of trauma, and this includes intergenerational poverty, long-term unemployment, business job relocation, limited employment opportunities, and overall community disinvestment. Again, if I don't feel connected, if I don't feel engaged, if I don't feel safe in my community, will I invest in my community? Or will I find other places to invest? You know, we sometimes think of intergenerational poverty. What if community trauma helped us to better understand how poverty moves across generations? Again, I'm not answering questions. I'm not coming up with solutions, but I think sometimes learning is about starting to ask ourselves these questions, starting to become curious. What is contributing to some of the things that we see? What is contributing to some of the issues that we see? Could it be more than just the individual? Could it be more than, you know, just a lack of ambition or a lack of initiative? Could there be more that's going on that perhaps is more far-reaching than just the individual? Could there be other cultural, other community impacts that has led to a traumatic experience that even the individual is not aware of, that then impacts how they interact with their community? And I think that these are questions that we have to start asking ourselves. This slide is just another way of seeing community trauma, the symptoms. Again, the equitable opportunities, the impact on the economic and educational environment, which then leads to intergenerational poverty, long-term unemployment, limited employment, disinvestment, in terms of the place, deteriorated environments that are unhealthy and often dangerous public spaces with a crumbling built environment, unhealthy products. So even if the next time you see a community that seems unkept, that seems like there's lack of care, I would just invite you to ask, what could be going on in that building? What could be going on in that home? What could be going on with those people that make it hard for them to feel invested, committed? Because again, I think sometimes we can be so quick to judge that we forget to ask, like, what could have happened to them? Okay? What could have happened to this community? Why might this community have a hard time investing in their physical environment, investing in their pursuit of, you know, bettering themselves or gaining different employment? So the other one would be, sorry, I moved ahead of that, would be social cultural environment. So as I mentioned, the relationships are impacted, social networks are impacted, social norms become changed, and a low sense of collective political and social efficacy. So even that, we think about policy building, like if individuals are existing and there is community trauma, there might be a lack of initiative to feel a sense of empowerment to address injustice, to address policy issues. They could be resigned to be like, one, I don't have the energy, but how could I contribute? What difference could I make? I did have a video here just talking about racial trauma, but I think I'll skip it and we'll just kind of define racial trauma. So racial trauma, which is also known as race-based traumatic stress, is a set of consequences that occur when a person of color deals with racism and discrimination. It encapsulates the varied psychological, mental, and emotional harm that is caused by witnessing racism and discrimination and by experiencing it firsthand. Symptoms of racial trauma include PTSD, chronic stress, as well as depression and anxiety. As you might suspect, based on how seriously and intensely racial trauma can manifest, racial trauma's impacts are far-reaching. Racial trauma leads to lower self-esteem and self-worth. The trauma of witnessing police brutality leads people of color, particularly Black people, to fear police, which can in turn be dangerous if they find themselves in situations where they need to rely on police assistance. Racial trauma can cause severe emotional problems, such as dissociative symptoms. Overall, racial trauma can impact every facet of life, reducing one's quality of living significantly. And I think it's important to consider, again, how racial trauma impacts the body. When we think about individuals, do I feel safe? Do I feel safe in my body? Do I feel safe in where I interact with? Again, safety is often about perceived threat. It's not about, is my environment actually safe? It's, do I feel safe here? And my body, again, when we think about the stress response, my body responds to perceived threat. So if I'm not feeling safe in an environment, my body will react to that, which is another reason why we have to increase our awareness of, how is my body reacting? Am I safe here? Am I not safe here? Is there something I can do to help myself feel calm? Because if I can't change my structural environment, the structural violence that I encounter, can I change how I relate to it? And I just see someone in the chat box. Yes, it is informative, racial trauma. And I think we could spend time alone just focusing on racial trauma, because I think it's an important topic that we consider a lot more, even when we think about like violence. And I'm going to be very just honest here for a few minutes. I do apologize because I know that we're at an hour and a half, but I do think that at times people wonder if certain communities may have put themselves in the position that they are in society. I think at times people wonder, like, well, what did they do to get them to where they are? And maybe they deserve it. And maybe there's just something inherently, wrong about them. And then when they look at whatever they see in the media, whatever they hear in the news, they almost feel like justified in their way of thinking. And I think it's important that, again, we put it into context. If I'm experiencing racial trauma, it impacts my brain's ability to function. It impacts how I learn. It impacts how I engage with the world around me. It impacts my self-efficacy. It impacts everything, every aspect, every facet of my life. It will then impact my ability to advance myself in society. So again, this is where we have to ask, what's happening here? What's contributing to this? Is there something inherently wrong about these people, inherently fill in the blank, or is there something else? Is the story more nuanced than that? Is it more complicated than that? And again, I think why I feel so strongly about talking about trauma is that it really helps me understand the body within the context of the community. How some people are able to thrive in the face of adversity, and others just have a hard time moving forward. And I think that as we talk more about race, I think trauma has to be part of the narrative. Yes. Okay. Sorry, I was just reading the chat box. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. So reducing the effects of ACEs and toxic stress. For those that have experienced ACEs, there are a range of possible responses that can help, including therapeutic sessions with mental health professionals, meditation and mindfulness, physical exercise, spending time in nature, and many others. The ideal approach, however, is to prevent the need for these responses by reducing the sources of stress in people's lives. This can happen by helping to meet their basic needs or providing other services. And again, I do want us to consider that we won't be able to eliminate stress. And I would say we probably don't want to eliminate stress or anxiety, but we want to be able to have tools to cope and to manage. And also we want to address the structural barriers, the economic injustice that constantly do just create systemic barriers. We want to address that. And I think as a community, it's our responsibility to address that. But again, I think we also have to learn healthy ways to cope. So it goes hand in hand. It's the individual within the context of society. We need to address it from an individual level, but also a community level as well. So currently, most efforts to address trauma focuses on the individual. As I mentioned, to successfully address trauma, And trauma-informed interventions should occur at both individual and community levels. Individual intervention typically occurs post-traumatization, whereas addressing trauma at the community level calls for an additional focus on primary prevention. By developing healthy communities, traumas can be prevented before the potentially traumatic events happen. And I think I like to think of it as like, I can't necessarily control everything that happens to me. I can't control what happens tomorrow. I can't control what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now, but I can, the more I feel supported within my community, the more I feel like I have coping tools, the effect and the impact of this will lessen. I will be able to manage in spite of what happens to me. And when I feel supported within the context of community, my ability to deal with these issues, it enhances. So this is just the social ecological model of trauma. And I think the reason why I included it is it helps us understand the individual, the relational, the community, the societal, and then our period of time in history. All of those impact how we understand trauma and how we experience trauma, right? I won't go into detail of it, just again, I'm mindful of the time, but I really like to think of who I am as an individual, what I experience as an individual, what I've been through as an individual within the context of my relationships, my community, my society, and where I'm at in history right now. So the Wheel of Wellness, I thought it was important to include this to really help us start to be mindful of what does wellness mean for me? And what do I need to consider in my pursuit of wellness? And this is where, you know, there's 8 components of wellness, which includes emotional, spiritual, intellectual, physical, environmental, financial, occupational, and social. Emotional is the ability to cope effectively with life and to create satisfying relationships. Spirituality is expanding our sense of purpose and meaning in life. Intellectual, recognizing our own creative abilities and finding ways to expand knowledge and skills. Physical includes recognizing the need for physical activity, sleep, and nutrition. Occupational, personal satisfaction and enrichment derived from one's work. Financial satisfaction with current and future financial situations. Environmental is good health by occupying pleasant, stimulating environments that support well-being. And social is developing a sense of connection, belonging, and a well-developed support system. So this slide just kind of, again, helps us to understand that we need to address this from an individual and community approach. That's how we build resilient communities. We consider how do we address the individual and how do we address the individual within the context of community as well. I won't show this video, just in the being mindful of time. So again, I think this is another, like, I want to use the term buzzword, resilience. And you know, I don't want words to lose their meanings. And, you know, when we think about what resilience actually means, like, it really means I don't have control over what happens to me in life. I have influence over it. I can, you know, but what I really do have control over is how I experience these situations. How do they impact me? And I think we've always thought of resiliency as building it in the individual, but I want to expand it and also say, like, how do we build resiliency within our communities? What does that look like? What does that mean? And just even starting to ask ourselves this question, like, what might it look like to build resiliency that then has a lasting impact on us as individuals, our families, and our neighborhoods and communities in a positive way. So I thank you all for staying. That is it. If anyone adverse therapy experience, I'd really love to hear what that is. I've never heard of that before. Dawn, I don't know if you want to share with them.
Sure. Hello everyone. I just came up with that because of the all the ACEs that you mentioned. And it's because I have experienced the racial, the sexual, and all as far as violence and trauma, racial, the sexual, the workplace, the abuse, all from workplace harassment and bullying, all led up to me having to be taken out by ambulance.
Mm,
I communicated this to my therapist.
mm,
Each incident, I was called a monkey
mm,
by one coworker in public around everyone. I was sexually assaulted by another employee, touching up under into my vaginal area. My managers and all that left a lot of work so much that I got injured. I had 2 strained shoulder injuries. And then after that, upon returning to work on my first day, the same managers came in, brought me into a room, yelled, fussed, harassed me so bad that I had pains in my chest and the ambulance had to come get me and take me out. I'm only saying that so everybody can understand. When I went to my therapist and explained it to my therapist told me I was just being paranoid.
mm.
After all that I experienced, I've never experienced any ACEs, any adverse childhood experiences. I'm a very well adjusted adult. I am also in my 50s. Never had this abuse in my life. Yet he diagnosed me with having a paranoid personality disorder. I asked him, why would you say that? He said, because you were suspicious of the people in the room. I said, I didn't even know they were going to pull me up and call me by intercom to even come back. And I didn't know they were going to ambush me in the way that they did. And the manager, where they were so abusive, and I had union representation, and nobody helped me while he was in my face abusing me so bad that I had to call out for help. And then I had so much pain in my chest, I fell to the ground. The ambulance had to come get me. So the reason why I say adverse therapy experience is because, as I'm being honest with you today, I was honest with my therapy and explained all of that to him. And then he turned my situation around on me and said that. And I asked him to remove it because it's a misdiagnosis. He said, in order for me to ever remove that from you, you'll have to go back to work because I'm off work. My doctor took me off. You have to go back to work and prove to me that you won't be suspicious. Stop complaining and prove to me that you can be successful in the work environment. I have over 20 to 30 years experience or more being successful in the work environment. Never been to jail. No history of any abuse. I don't smoke. I don't drink. I don't get high. Not judging if people do. Never been in an abusive relationship. All my abuse happened at work. And that's what he said to me.
Dawn, I want to thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, that's why I said that so everyone can know. So it's really hard what I'm going through. Yeah.
And as you were talking, I couldn't help but think how important it is for us as individuals within the context of our communities, whether it's with our neighbors, whether it's in our work environments, again, to ask ourselves, what is that individual going through? What could have happened to them? We didn't have a chance to even talk about how trauma impacts mental health, right?
Mhm.
What you went through, how that impacts how you function, having to leave in an ambulance because of the physiological response you had to what was happening to you, that shows a significant impact on your overall health. And I again, this is where I feel so strongly about this topic and so strongly about what we discussed today, because we have to start understanding as a community how what's happened to us contributes to how we function as individuals and what we go through. And Dawn, I would imagine that the thought of going back to work is really hard for you. So it must be frustrating that he's then thinking you have to go back in order for me to take this. I would wonder, how do you address that piece around going back to work? So I do thank you for sharing that. And again, I think what we can all take away from that is the importance of understanding how what has happened to us impacts how we function within the context of our society, whether it's at work, whether it's in our neighborhoods, whether it's within the context of our families. Yes, thank you. And Prophetess, I do see your hand as well.
Wow. Don, I just want to commend you for speaking up and be the voice for the voiceless, because other communities do not understand the trauma that we perpetually experience, in the workplace and just within the community and in other spaces. We're just absolutely not safe. We're not taken seriously when we do file a complaint. Like yourself, I'm in the same situation, with my work, and I've been terminated from that. And when you do go through the protocol of HR and all of that, you're just looked at as being not invisible. And it goes back to how society continues to view people of color, the melanated community. And we are not even human beings in their sight for some. I'm not saying for all, right? And so it's so important that we have these workshops. And I wish you had, if we have enough time and if it's okay with everybody, to really go over the video with racial trauma, because it's real. And literally our community continues to be bleeding out and hemorrhaging, and the mental health and the stress is so much that I don't even know how to begin to address it. And this is something that we need to constantly talk about. And, I'm so sorry for your experience, even within the workplace, because that should never happen. Had it been a white woman experiencing that, the police would have been called, charges would have been laid, and the list just goes on. And so this just goes back to, we are not human being at all. And I'm not even too sure how to address it, because it's unfair. There's two sets of laws within, the Canadian society, and it continues to happen to our community, and nobody's doing anything about it. So I just want to say thank you. And I totally can identify with you in terms of the experiences that I have experienced from now up until, it an adulthood, let's just say. And I think what continues to jump out at me is when I was 7 within an educational institution. That was my discovery, that I even had a color, coming from a country like Jamaica, who has every single nation that's there. It was in an institution, being called a monkey, being called dirty. And so when you were talking, it was very traumatic and triggering for me. So I just want to commend you for being the voice for the voiceless, because we are tired.
Yes. And another thing I would like to add, my employer, when I asked for information as to why was I calling the meeting, they were told, the store manager was told that by HR, that they couldn't talk about it. I went to my union. My union sent me a letter. I have it in writing, and stated that your injuries created the issues in the work environment. My union.
The other thing that is very common is because of, women of color, people of color, especially women, we're crazy.
Yeah.
We're crazy. And then to be able to somehow mentally label you or medically diagnose you of such, because you were what, it's just frustrated. I just don't know this. It's frustrated. And I just hope that, we could band together as a community and be that voice and speak out against these horrific, unspeakable experiences. And I'm talking lived experience that we're all going through, not to even mention our males.
Yep.
We're not even going to go there. And so I'm broken by what I've just heard, broken. And it's unacceptable by an employer or anyone, a human being. We as people of color, we're a human being. We have the same blood, and unfortunately, animals are treated better than we are.
Sure. Very true.
Again, that's just my opinion, and my opinion, right? And from my own lived experience, dogs are treated better than we are.
Thank you for listening, everyone. I really appreciate that. Thank you for hearing me. because I feel like I haven't been heard and I haven't been. And it's frustrating and it spins your wheel mentally, and as you stated, to ask me to go back to work, I'm not healthy enough. It's been a year now and I'm still trying to process it. Plus I had the shoulder injuries. So it was overlapped and I'm still dealing with the injuries, healing from them as well. So yeah. But so I thank you all. And that's why I came up with ATE, adverse therapy experience. That's why. And I'm going to use it from now on. And everyone else, welcome too.
And again, as I mentioned, at the beginning, this topic, what we discussed today, it brings up a lot of, memories, a lot of personal experiences, a lot of emotions, and this is why it is a difficult topic to talk about, but also a very important topic to talk about. And so the question is, how do we create space to have these difficult conversations, but how do we leave feeling hopeful, right? Feeling hopeful that change can happen, feeling hopeful that, as a community, there can be increased awareness, that it doesn't always have to be this way. And I think personally for me, I've been in a place where I have to start believing that it doesn't always have to be this way. Things can get better. And that's why I'm here. That's why I chose this topic. That's why we're having these discussions, because I think the more we create awareness and realize our own individual experience and how what we've been through impacts us, but also how our community impacts us, then we address ourselves at an individual level, but we also then address the community, right? So I do hope that, like I said, it's a Sunday afternoon. We just had a very heavy discussion. And I do think it's important that you are all mindful about how what you've heard is going to impact you. And I would encourage you to, again, just take a quick time outside, engage in, a breathing exercise, take some deep breaths, ground yourself. There's meditation exercises online, and thinking about it now, I should have wrapped up with one. But I would really encourage you to take care of yourselves. It's hard to carry this. And again, be mindful of how it takes a toll on your body. And this is where we want to start addressing the toxic stress, right? Be really mindful of taking care of your bodies. David, it was asked that I share this video. Is it okay if I do, or okay? Yeah, okay, let's do it. We'll do it quickly.
I'll just say one thing really quickly, which is that thanks so much for everyone coming out. Of course, this has gone longer than we may have expected, but everyone's free to leave when they are. So I feel like if people are still getting value out of this, then I personally have no problem with Taye going as long as she feels fit.
Okay, I'll just share the video. I have to if I can, if I'm able to, I will try. You guys are able to see?
You don't know the pain we feel. You don't know what we gotta do. You got no respect for how we live it. You gotta sit here teaching us this grammar. And then we gotta go out there again. And what are you telling me about that, huh? What are you doing in here that makes a difference in my life? You don't feel respected. Is that what you're saying, Ava? Well, maybe you're not. But to get respect, you have to give it.
That's bull.
What?
Why should I give my respect to you? Because you're a teacher. I don't know you. How do I know you're not a liar standing up there? How do I know you're not a bad person standing up there? I'm not just going to give you my respect because you're called a teacher.
White people always wanting their respect like they deserve it for free. I'm a teacher. Doesn't matter what color I am. All about color. It's about people deciding what you deserve, about people wanting what they don't deserve, about whites thinking they run this world no matter what. You see, I hate white people. You hate me? Yeah. You don't know me. I know what you can do. I saw white cops shoot my friend in the back for reaching into his pocket. His pocket. I saw white cops break into my house and take my father for no reason except because they feel like it. except because they can. And they can because they're white. So I hate white people on sight. Ben, do you have anything to say?
Can you please get out of here?
Lady, stop acting like you trying to understand our situation and just do your little babysitting up there.
That's all you think this is?
It ain't nothing else. When I look out in the world, I don't see nobody that looks like me with their pockets full unless they rapping a lyric or dribbling the ball. So what else you got in here for me?
And what if you can't rap a lyric or dribble a ball?
It ain't this. I know that much. Right.
And you all think you're gonna make it to graduation like this?
I made it to high school, ain't nobody stopped me. Lady, I'm lucky if I make it to 18. We in the war. We graduating every day we live because we ain't afraid to die protecting our own. At least when you die for your own, you die with respect. You die warrior.
Right. So when you're dead, you'll get respect. Is that what you think? Yeah. You know what's gonna happen when you die? You're gonna rot in the ground, and people are gonna go on living. They're gonna forget all about you. And when you rot, do you think it's gonna matter whether you were an original gangster? You're dead. Nobody is gonna want to remember you because all you left behind in this world is this.
So the reason why I wanted to share that is I think it gives a great understanding of how racial trauma impacts how we perceive the world, how we interact with the world, and how we interact with other bodies, white bodies, right? I don't know if any of you have seen the movie, but that's from the movie Freedom Writers, and it's actually based on a real story, a true story, actual events. And it's a story about a teacher who goes into an underserved community, and through providing them space to share their stories and talk about their stories, she brings about healing. And in bringing about healing, they all graduate, and again, based on a true story, but they all have hope, the sense of I can feel empowered to do something. And I think what we saw in that clip is an example of the toll that racial trauma can take, the toll that community trauma can take, the toll that community violence can take on individuals. And again, I felt that was a really great example of just how it all accumulates: racial trauma, individual trauma, community violence, community trauma, and then how it impacts how we interact with our world. And again, but that's not the full story. The story doesn't end there. And then I can't help but wonder, like, is there space to create more opportunities like the one this teacher created? And what does that take? And what does that mean for us as individuals as we interact with the world? How do we then equip ourselves with knowledge to then help us to empower others, right? And this is where I think our own individual healing is important as we move towards healing our community. So I want to thank you all. I didn't think it was going to be this long, but I do appreciate you engaging, you staying, providing space to talk about such an important topic, but very difficult topic to talk about as well. So thank you all very much. David, I don't know if you want to say anything to.
Yeah, I'm just unmuting. Thank you so much for hosting this. Thanks so much for your time and your expertise. Yeah, just thank you. And also a huge thanks to everyone that came out. Taye, I do know some people were asking about slide deck. If you'd be able to send, would you be able to send that through my email?
I will send that to you for sure. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to drop my email in the chat. And if people want access to slide deck or want to get in touch with us, please just do not hesitate to send me an email. If you want, feel free to directly message me your email and I'll reach out to you too. So I'm just going to stay on for a few minutes longer just so people can, copy down my email. But I think that's the end of the workshop. And yeah, as Bill said in chat, take care, everyone. Thank you all so much.
And I'll emphasize that too. Please take care of yourselves today. A heavy topic, so do something for your bodies, please. Thank you.
As a final thought, Taye, perhaps you might want to share your contact information with folks in chat, or maybe perhaps not, but
Yeah, I can do. I'll try an email. Thanks. Thank you. All right. Have a great day, everyone.
take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Thank you, Taye.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
This was fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna end the meeting now.